Let me pray. Father, will you teach us today as we open up this amazing, amazing book that's been so easy for us to kind of set aside. And I don't know what people have come in here today with, whether they're tired, whether there are things that are stresses in their lives, but would you put a curtain around our time together so that in these next few minutes we can not only open your word, but feel like we are understanding your heart even more. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, last week I invited you to step into the world's best mystery. And I did it with my favorite dog. Snoopy did a lot of different things, but one of the things he did is write mysteries. And every book he writes starts the same way. It was a dark and stormy night. And I want to invite you into this incredible mystery of Genesis. But if you remember from last week, I said there was kind of an entry fee. Here it is. We must sit and listen as if we are hearing Genesis for the first time. Because here's what happens. If you've been around churches or people of faith, you hear it and you just kind of take it for granted, and you stop listening as though you hear it for the first time, and you just kind of, your eyes glaze over. What I want to do in this series is to back up and experience Genesis maybe a little bit closer to what the first audience is, how it would have felt to them. But before I go there, because we've got new folks every week, let me back up and just do a bit of a recap. The form of Genesis, well, it's a little bit like an academic journal article, where one person is the prime author, and then other people over time, other specialists add their bits and pieces until it gets its final form. The form of Genesis is kind of like that. We know that it was finished, its finished form was right around 550 BC. That's its finished form. But it looks like, as best we can tell, it first was written at around 1300 BC. So quite a few years difference there. And that doesn't need to bother us, because that quite often was how documents were created. But what was who was its author? Well, the best candidate we have, even though his name is never mentioned in the book itself, it's later in one of the later books in the Pentateuch, is Moses. He's got education, he's got the stature, he's got the time. Now, why would he write something like that? I love asking questions when I'm opening up the text to say, why that? Why there? Why write a book like this? And the best thing that we can come up with for a purpose is that he has given this assignment of taking this huge group of people who've come out of Egypt as slaves. And his assignment is to help build a faith into all of these people who had just a ragtag mixture of beliefs before. So Genesis is really him attempting to disciple a new nation of people. Pretty incredible. Now, last week I shared 3 hacks of how you need to get ready to read something like this. Here's the first one. We're reading somebody else's mail. It was not written to us, but it was written for us. Okay, let that one sink in. We're not the primary audience. It was written to somebody else. It made sense in their world. We get to be the recipients years later. Here's number 2. The story was way more than just a story to them, because in Israel, you did your philosophy, you did your theology, not by writing long treatises like the Greeks did, but by telling stories. Now, Jesus is going to continue this same idea with the parables. Jesus does his theology with parables. Well, that's a pattern that started all of these years earlier. Here's the third one. Genesis was created with an exquisite craftsmanship. It's not just a storybook of assorted stories that somebody decided to put together. I had to learn this the hard way. At university, and that was quite a while ago for me now, but I wanted to think of myself as someone who, well, I'd be willing to take a stand for my faith. I had that kind of a heartbeat inside of me. But still, I wasn't prepared for the day when my professor, as I was walking out of class, he said, Mr. Oswald, am I right to assume that you think of yourself as a Christian? Well, I have a question for you. Do you believe in the creation story? Now, I did not have time to get ready to think about an answer. This is one of those where you just get hit cold with it. I said, I guess so. And he nodded his head, and then he said, so which creation story do you believe in? Okay, have you ever been in a situation like this? You know, your palms start sweating really, really quickly. I said, so what do you mean? And he goes, well, you do know that there are two creation stories, right? And inside I'm thinking, what? I've never heard that before. And then he said, well, there are two. And they are quite different, you know. I think you need to go back to your Bible and read Genesis again. That was it. Never, ever had another conversation with my professor like that. So I went back to my dorm room, and I have to tell you, that made me really nervous. I didn't immediately open my Bible and read the book of Genesis because it felt like I was stepping into a dark and stormy night. Because wasn't I tempting doubt a little bit to read with those kinds of eyes? Hadn't Genesis as it was shaped the modern world like no other book? Hadn't Jesus and St. Paul both believed in the book of Genesis and quoted from it? If they could trust it, who was I to pick it apart? I felt like I was being a little bit disloyal. Besides, and it already felt like, at least in my context, like people were battling over the book of Genesis and origins and creation, because in my parents' Bible, the big family Bible, over to one side, in the side margin, it said creation of the world, 4004 BC, by the Bishop Ussher. And I can remember seeing that even when I was high school or college, going, really? And so I didn't know whether to put the book of Genesis under my microscope or not. I don't know if you've ever felt that way. But this series on Genesis gives us a chance to do that just a little bit. And that night, opening up Genesis and reading again, was the beginning of several ahas that I would come to over my life about this book that is so foundational to faith. Here's the first aha. I really hadn't read Genesis very well at all. Somehow it was something that the pastor read or the Sunday school teacher taught, but frankly, Genesis 1 and goes into Genesis 2, first 3 verses, and then Genesis 2 and 3 are so different. Let me tick through some of the differences. They actually use different names for God between the two accounts, the two creation accounts. The first uses the name Elohim, and that's kind of the general name for God. It's like God. In the second side, the second account, the name for God becomes the Lord. It's where we get our name Yahweh for God. That was surprising. And I need to say that Elohim was like just saying God. If you used the Lord, it was like a personal name for God, like Joshua or something like that. Here's another one. There are differences, deep differences in style and scope. Genesis 1 has a unique rhythm like poetry and repeating patterns like it was evening and morning of day 1 or day 2. And there are 6 days of creation, and it just feels like a repetition going on. Genesis 2 and 3 feel much more like just a story. Here's another. Genesis 1 is all about population groups and humanity. Chapter 2 and 3 is where everything comes down to one story, with a family where they get names, Adam and Eve. Did you realize that Adam is never even named in Genesis 1? Here's another one. In Genesis 1, the earth is water drenched. But in Genesis 2, the earth is a dry wilderness until streams or mists provide water. And even the creation sequences are different. In Genesis 1, it's water, land, plants, mammals, and humans. But in Genesis 2, it's land, water, humans, plants, animals. And finally, woman. And some suggested that Genesis 2 and Genesis 3 were actually written first. Who knows? All I know is that I saw those things and I felt stuck. I felt like my faith had been kicked out from under me a little bit, because maybe my professor was right that these were just stories gathered over time. And because I'd never heard this before, and I heard it from something like him, it rocked me. It did. But here's the good news. Since my university days, most scholars have done a bit of a turnaround. And now they see Genesis as really being a planned whole piece of cloth together. And that leads into my second aha. The differences aren't the problem. They're part of the design. Of course, those final editors in 550 BC saw how things didn't line up exactly, and it didn't bother them, and they didn't change it. That was fascinating. And as it turns out, the differences actually serve a purpose. They create the drama. Let me explain it this way. Have you seen movies where the same event is shown from 2 or 3 different perspectives? Same event, but through different eyes, things clash and all begin to kind of make sense. That's what's happening between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. Let me give you an example. So in Genesis 1, each one of those days something gets repeated. And it was good. And it was good. And it was good. And the creation of man, and it was very good. Then chapter 2. Man is created. And it was not good that he was alone. Those are meant to come together and create a sense of, oh, let's see where this is heading. And it pulls us deeper into the story. And so what it looks like, folks, is that Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 aren't in competition at all. Genesis 1 is like the prologue. It's the Greek choir standing up before the play starts and telling us where everything's going to go. It sets the tone for everything that we're going to see. And so all of this sent me back into chapter 1 with some new eyes. And this is my third aha. Genesis 1 is way, way more fascinating than I had ever thought. Now, Moses, I don't think, is really trying to set them straight on the most scientific understanding of how the world actually began. Because he actually begins with how most people generally conceived the creation. You know, the framework under the earth and where the rains and waters come from. Moses is not trying to teach them about that. He's taking them from what most people already knew or believed, and he's going to open up something entirely different about who God is. So let me show you why I come to those conclusions. So let's start with the grammar. Next slide. Okay, I'm not going to take you through all of this, but the text is so fascinating. It is, well, you know what? It's like a Rolex watch. There are 7 words in Genesis 1, verse 1. The number of letters equals 28. Well, that's 7 times 4. There are 14 words in Genesis 1 and 2. There's 7 paragraphs in Genesis 1 through chapter 2, verse 3. The 3 key words, God, heaven, and earth, each have 14 letters. That's 7 times 2, it's 14. The number of letters in the 4 remaining words is also 14. Are you beginning to get the idea here? That this isn't just somebody sitting around on a Saturday afternoon and saying, I think I'm going to write a book. This is assembled, like I said, like a Rolex watch. Carefully considered. Letters counted. Words counted. And I don't mean a little here. This is so overwhelming. And it speaks to somebody intending to tell a story all around the number 7. The idea of perfection, completion, wholeness, fulfillment. Moses and those who are going to be writing with him want to get that message coming across very, very clearly about who God is. And I could geek out on this like all day long, and I know what you're really thinking. Must have waffles. Must have waffles. So let me keep going. Let's look at the days of Genesis 1. When you map out the 7 days of creation, days 1 through 3, now stick with me on this, days 1 through 3 actually correspond to days 4 through 6. I've got a little graphic for you here. Next slide. Something like this, and I wish it was a little bit bigger for you. But days 1 through 3 are all about forming. They're all about creating the house. Days 4 through 6 align with those, and they are all about filling the house. So you've got forming and you've got filling. And day 1, the creation of light, lines up with day 4, the heavenly luminaries. Day 2 is the division of water. Well, day 5 is sky and sea creatures. It's what goes into the water. Day 3 is the appearance of land, the creation of plants and trees. Day 6 lines up with that. Land, animals, and humans. And folks, that cadence, that feel, that alignment, this is Hebrew poetry. And the thing you need to understand about Hebrew poetry is that it never rhymes. They don't do it that way. Let me give you an example. If I said, come to our house this evening for a great flat circle of Italian flavor. What do you think I'm talking about? Okay, are you awake at all? What's it talking about? Pizza. But it doesn't get left there. You follow it up with another line that doesn't rhyme, but it says much the same thing. It just expands a little bit more. So if the first one was, come to my house this evening for a great flat circle of Italian flavor, the second line could be, join us tonight for round, savory plates of delicious burning meat and cheese. Now you know entirely what I'm talking about. Yeah, it's pizza. And that's what you have in days 1 through 3 and then days 4 through 6, is that you've got, and it was evening and it was morning, and it was evening and it was morning, and it was evening, and there's this sense of it all being assembled together in some marvelous, marvelous Hebrew poetry. And here's what's happening. Moses is building towards a crescendo of what he wants to tell us about who this God is. He's making a point about something even much bigger than biology. And let's think about this, even in one additional way that I think is pretty compelling. When we talk about the 7 days of creation, we're so familiar with hearing about the days of creation and the 7 days of creation that we don't step back and hear what it might have felt like if we were the original audience. Where does the idea of 7 days come from? Was there anything that took place in their world that they already understood that this would connect to? Well, I think there is. In the ancient Near East, whenever a new temple was built, it went through 6 days of dedication before the 7th day, when the shrine of the god or the goddess would be brought into the temple. That's fascinating. Think about what Moses is saying. This God of ours isn't dependent on a human temple that we might build. His temple is, well, it's everything. It's sun, moon, and stars. It's animals. It's our times. It's us. All of us together. We've been assembled as His amazing temple. And isn't this the idea behind Isaiah 6? I saw the Lord high and lifted up, and just the train of His robe consumed the temple. Isaiah is building off of this very same idea that unlike the gods that all of you former slaves have followed your entire lives, you've thought in terms that God is in the building here or God is in a building there. You have been thinking far too small, because this God's temple is all of what He has created. So then, what happens on day 7? Genesis 2. God moves into what He has created. And we're told that God does what? He rests. Now, isn't that curious? After all of this creation of time and sun and moon and stars and galaxies and all of that, is this God so tired that He needs to find a good chair someplace and have a nap? I don't think so. Think of it this way. When we read that Prime Minister Eunice Gartura, did I even get close to it in saying his name correctly? KP, help me out here. What he said. All right. And I'm going to, you're going to really scold me on this one. When he took office at Incognita Cara, okay, whatever. You get in his important building where he lives, we would hear that he would sit at his desk. Well, when he is sitting at his desk, that could mean that he is tired from all of his campaigning and he just wants to rest there. Is that what sitting behind his desk means? No. It means that as seated, he now leads and administers the entire country. I am really pretty convinced that when we read that God rested on the seventh day, he has somehow become part of what he has created. And when he rests, it means that he is now administering all of what he has created. So he's not a God who creates and then walks off the stage. No, just the opposite. So he imagines, he creates, he establishes, and then he enters into. And he continues his role in our lives. He's not a God a long way off, just the opposite. He is a God who has chosen to camp out among us, Emmanuel. So, let me give you 4 takeaways. First, science and the book of Genesis are not enemies. Science addresses the questions of how. Genesis 1 is answering the question of who and why. Does that make sense? Science is an attempt to answer the questions of how. Genesis 1 is attempting to answer the questions of who is behind it all and why. And we're going to be unpacking that next week. Second, my professor was right, but also wrong. There are 2 creation accounts, but instead of undermining faith, the 2 actually fortify it. They're meant to fit together in tandem. Genesis 1 is the finely crafted introduction to the whole book of Genesis, and maybe the whole Old Testament, and maybe the whole Bible. It's the introduction, it's the prologue, it's the doxology, getting us ready for everything that we're going to see. And number 4, I want you to really expand your thinking. I want you to meet the God who existed outside our quaint dimensions of time and width and space and height. This is the most God. He existed before our time, and he will continue to exist long after time as we know it comes to an exclamation point. He's not the big guy upstairs. He's not the bearded grandfather who's always watching us and is mildly upset at us for misbehaving. Our God is much greater than that. The extent of his emotions for us are beyond what we can ask or imagine. He chose to innovate, create, and then somehow step into our cosmos, our experience, to know us, at times to grieve with us, and to be with us, and to rescue us. Last week, I said that this series definitely is for people of faith, to expand your understanding of God. John Wesley said that if God was a God that I could understand, I wouldn't want to follow him. Do you understand his point? That if he could get his mind around all of who God was, then he wasn't much of a God. And what I want to do is to say, this God that we serve is so much beyond us, but so close to us at the same time. He is with us in our victories, and he is with us in what breaks our hearts. But I also said when I started this series is that I believe the book of Genesis can speak just as beautifully to a modern skeptical audience. Because it speaks to a world even before the Big Bang. That there is a God who is there, and he knows, and he loves. If that is not something within your experience, I would love to talk to you after the service. I would love to pray with you. Because I want you to look at Genesis 1 through 11 with new eyes. That Genesis 1 through 11 is astoundingly up to date. And it speaks to a world that embraces quantum physics and space travel and artificial intelligence. I'd like the team to come on up, and the theme of their song is thinking about the Lord. And as we sing this, I guess what I would hope is that you wouldn't just sing the words, that you might even say, "Wow, God, as I'm thinking about you, expand my understanding. Show me the areas where I've thought of you in too simple of ways. Help me to embrace all of who you are and what you have for me in my life and what you have for my future." Team?